We talk shipyards, starship construction, and more on today's Star Wars video. Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome to another video. Today's episode is brought to you by the Eckhart's Ladder Patreon. Right now, I've just put a new post up with an exclusive opportunity for patrons to ask me questions with a guaranteed answer either in text form or in a full video, so you can go there, check that out. We will always be answering questions, however, from you fine community members, and today's comes from Call Me the Fishy, who says, how were capital ships actually built in Star Wars? Was it on the ground or in space? Was it organic workers or drones? How were capital ships built in just a few weeks? So those are lots of really interesting questions. For this video, we are going to stick to Star Wars Legends simply because canon seems to have at least contradictory information. We've heard about the orbital rings of Kuat, but we also see on planets like Corellia that somehow ships are also built on a planetary surface, then brought up into space, which seems to be more resource intensive, but it's fine. I will say this question sent me absolutely spiraling. In the back of my head, I remembered seeing a map of major shipyards in Star Wars with some helpful information, but I looked through the Essential Atlas, which is where I first assumed it would be. It wasn't there. I couldn't find anything on it in Google. Then I saw a snippet of it in one of my old videos. I realized it was probably in the Essential Guide to Warfare, but it wasn't, at least in my digital copy. Turns out the digital copy is missing a bunch of diagrams, and this is one of them. Sorry for the poor quality. It's scanned from a physical book, but we get a decent overview of how shipbuilding worked, at least in the Imperial era. So major shipyards were ranked by their ability to construct large cruiser fleets. However, because of the prominence of Imperial Star Destroyers, many smaller shipyards were actually upgraded so they could work on those vessels as well. You can see that there were several Class 1A Imperial military shipyards across the galaxy, and in the Imperial era, the civilian shipyards were essentially nationalized as well, especially the big important ones like Kuat. I'll come back to that in a second, but we also have to realize that the way things were set up by the time of the Empire was not how things always were. And when you read the Essential Guide to Warfare, you kind of get the idea that shipbuilding in the pre-Clone Wars era Republic, and I mean thousands of years before, was significantly more varied, whereas towards the Clone Wars, we see the emergence and the domination of several massive corporations. What's interesting is that many of these corporations were responsible not only for the end stage shipbuilding, but also everything from resource extraction to mineral processing to labor sourcing and more. That's why many of these most prominent shipyards were in systems with significant mineral deposits. For example, the Corellian shipyards made significant use of asteroid belts and other material in the system. Kuat Drive Yards was headquartered in an orbital ring around the planet Kuat, and facilities within the ring itself and on the ground played major roles in, again, not just construction, but everything from resource processing to defense. But aside from these mega shipbuilders doing everything, we also really commonly saw the combination of shipbuilders and ship designers who would then essentially look to smaller shipyards as independent production centers. Probably the best example of this was with Rendili's Star Drive. Although the planet Rendili initially produced ships on its own and across other planets in its domain, Rendili designs were eventually outsourced to smaller shipyards across the mid and outer rim. So although Rendili did not have the same pure industrial output on a planetary scale as Kuat, through diversification they were able to keep up with ship production for a while at least before eventually being succeeded by other companies. But across the Star Wars galaxy, if you can imagine a way ships are produced, there's probably a planet which represents that. Well, the shipyard ring systems seem to be very common for larger shipyards. On Bottajef, for example, we know some production was done on the ground before being lifted to space by a series of orbital elevators. In the Black Fleet Crisis, we learn all about deep space orbital shipyards. These would have been spread across the entire galaxy and were essentially mobile maintenance and construction facilities for use in place where the Empire didn't have otherwise reliable shipyards. The Kunat cluster was a great example. The Empire didn't have a major military presence there outside of Black Sword Command, so several mobile orbital shipyards were brought into the sector and tied directly to the local fleet. That ended up going poorly for them, but that's a completely different story. These shipyards, however, not just built ships, but also served as essentially the hub for several dozen large Imperial vessels, including super star destroyers. So hopefully that answers some of the question. How were capital ships actually built in Star Wars? Well, usually across a variety of shipyards, locations which would end up being among the most important in the Star Wars galaxy. If you read the Yuuzhan Vong series, for example, you can see that the New Republic uses these important industrial planets like Kuat or Corellia or Fondor or Sluis Van or Bilbringi essentially as carrots for the Yuuzhan Vong because they were just such juicy targets. On the other hand, the loss of one of these planets, as with Fondor, was absolutely devastating to the war effort. I know that map I showed earlier classified shipyards simply based on the largest ship they could produce, but there also were just some 1A shipyards, facilities above the rest in terms of production output and capability. I put Fondor, Kuat, Mon Calamari, probably Forost, Corellia, all up there, maybe a few others, at least during the New Republic era. Mon Calamari in particular was so prominent simply because the New Republic loved Mon Calamari designs so much, the government basically wrote a blank check for the Mon Cala to produce as many ships as possible. And to the final part of the question, how were capital ships built in just a few weeks? I don't know if that's exactly how I would put the timeline. I know that the Thrawn trilogy somewhere goes over more of the actual capacity for the Empire to build. I feel like I'm maybe mixing this up, but I think there's a scene where there's like an under construction Star Destroyer blown up and they go into it there. If you remember what I'm talking about, let me know. But that also does remind me, one of the things that Thrawn has to deal with is the fact that even the most self-reliant shipyards do need some outside resources which are rare, like Tabana gas. So keep that in mind. When it came to building something like a completely new class of ships, we know with the New Republic, the MC-90 was going to take so long, about a year and a half, to start being produced that they actually made an in-between ship, the MC-80B, to help serve in the meantime. As for whether it was organic crew or drones, you do see a lot of organic crew. Some shipyards would have been more heavily automated. The CIS obviously had automated shipyards, but on Kuat, for example, there were millions, if not billions, of workers involved in the construction of ships. This is the last thing I want to mention too. One sort of neat aspect of Star Wars is all the hidden shipyards which exist. Palpatine had many in the deep core, which not only build ships, but kept them ready in reserve in case of an emergency. The CIS, we know from the Essential Guide to Warfare, actually had automated shipyards basically operating outside of the galaxy itself, way far off, away from everything else, in almost total seclusion. But yeah, that's all I got. Let me know what you guys thought of this video, and if there's any hashtag AskEck questions you'd like to know. Obviously, of course, leave them in the comments, or you can join on Patreon to guarantee an answer. We've got some really cheap tiers. I think $1.50 is the cheapest, and right now I'm still leaving that tier pretty much open to everything. But I'll see you guys later.